Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello, welcome back to Fighting on Film. First off, we want to say hello and welcome to our new Patreons. We had a couple of new members, and we won't say any names, but we want to thank them for their patronage and supporting the podcast. Always means a lot to us.
It does indeed.
It really does. Really nice to see. Helps us ticking over the pod with all the hosting fees and renting movies and whatnot. And this week we have what we think is a little bit of a forgotten gem, bit of a hidden gem, Diamond in the Rough movie. And we are looking at 1943's Nine Men.
Yeah, I think this might actually be my favourite British Army in the Desert film. It's the most action-packed.
Strong contender, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's quite a few, obviously, but this one's a really interesting look at just a standard infantry section. It's a last stand movie.
We all know Matt
which we love. We love a last stand. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not LRDG. It's not men on a mission. It's a group of chaps that were off on patrol. Their truck got bogged down in sand, attacked by enemy aircraft, and they found themselves lost in the desert trying to get back to their lines. And they holed up in an abandoned hut, and there's a siege. And it's kind of like, when I found the movie and I was talking to Rob about it, I was like, it's like The Way Ahead meets Sahara.
Yeah, it is. That's the easiest way to describe it.
Yeah.
It's a very no frills kind of movie, but in a really good way. There's nothing else attached to the plot. There's no love interest. There's no, will command get the message in time. There's nothing like that. It's literally just these 9 chaps in the desert and their fight for their own lives. Basically, it's
it's very pure in that respect. It's
very trim, but it's very hard hitting, and it's very well made. So I think I'll kick us off with production this week. So the movie is produced by Ealing Studios. They're really well known for their post-war comedies such as Passport to Pimlico, Lavender Hill Mob, The Lady Killers. But they also produced a lot of war movies during the Second World War itself. They were responsible for Went the Day Well, Convoy, Sander Metro London. There's a lot of pedigree behind this movie in Ealing Studios, as we know over here. And, certainly film fans will know their pedigree. And the movie was directed by a chap called Henry Watt. Now, he's a Scottish director. He rose to fame before the war, working for the GPO film unit pre-war. And then during the war, he switched to doing propaganda documentaries. So he made Squadron 992 in 1939. He made the really well-remembered film London Can Take It in 1940. Yeah. Fans of public service broadcasting will know what that one's from. Mm-hmm, it's one of their tracks. He also did Target for Tonight in 1941. And then he was poached by Ealing to do this film because they had success, obviously, with Went the Day Well in 1942, year before, and they used a documentary filmmaker to direct that. So they were going from like a realistic approach to their war films. So Henry Watt is poached from GPO, and he directs this one. It was made for an absolutely tiny budget of £20,000. Now, that might seem like a lot in 1940 standards, but 1943, but it's really not a lot of money in any sort of sense. So written by Watt as well, and it was originally called Umpty Poo. We'll explain what that means later. And it was based on a short story by Gerald Kirsch. And the War Office helped out with the producing and making of the film. They didn't even look at the script, apparently. They were just like, yeah, that's fine, that sounds good to us, and they helped out. So we have men of the South Wales Borderers and the London Irish Rifles helping on the production. So all the men that you see, like running around that aren't the main cast is pretty much those 2 regiments. And interestingly enough, the London Irish Regiment asked for their leave to be cancelled so they could take part in the film. And apparently it was the first time in history that ever happened.
Well, they got a beach holiday in Wales anyway, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm thinking. It's like, do we want to leave, or do we want to have a paid trip to Wales? It's like, come on. So yeah, it was a shot in Wales at Margam Sands in Glamorgan, and Henry Watt does a fantastic job making those sand dunes look like a Tunisian desert.
Yeah, when I found out that it was shot there, I was like, that's impressive.
What he does with what he's got it's really, really impressive. Yeah. And the music for this one was by John Greenwood. He worked on other Ealing projects, most notably Sander Metro London. He did the sound for that. And it has a march in it called the 8th Army March, and that was used to bookend the film. And that was by Eric Coates. And it was used by the BBC when they transmitted programs out to the armed forces in the desert in the war. So it's a nice connection there. And it initially had a limited release in London. Now, the movie gets really well received. People really like it as a tribute to the 8th Army who'd been fighting. Obviously, by 1943, the war in the desert was turning. You know, we had them on the run. The Operation Torch had happened late 42. So people could believe a film about a bunch of chaps, you know, but spoiler alert, winning a battle in the desert wasn't far from the truth at home. So after that, the film gets a general release in February, and it goes on to be really universally loved. So Kinematograph Weekly said, the picture accomplishes many tasks, one and the same as a pep talk. For fed-up troops and civilians, an exciting illustration of the science and practice of modern desert warfare, and a worthy tribute to the men who have been and are still doing the fighting. And then I've got a review from good old Reg Whitley of the Daily Mirror. So this was on the Friday, the 29th of January, just as it was going into general release. So this is about a piece about Jack Lambert, chap who plays the lead character. Matt will talk about the cast in a minute. But it says 9 Men, who was directed by Henry Watt, who has made a good job as he did for Target for Tonight. The choice was a good one, for everybody will be impressed for the fine acting. The fight against the lack of water, sleep and ammunition is vividly pictured. Un Petit Peu, a little bit extra, aptly describes what those boys pulled out at heavy odds in the sand-swept desert. So convincing are the settings that it is difficult to realise they were created on the sands of South Wales and an Ealing studio. A first-class tribute to the PBI, a gripping story of self-sacrifice and heroism.
Good review.
And lastly, just thought I'd say before we segue into cast, the movie comes out a month before Desert Victory comes out.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Where does it sit in comparison?
Well, the AFPU, obviously that comes out a month before, and I've been reading some contemporary books about British war films and propaganda from war, and it feels like 9 Men is a little bit overshadowed by the success of Desert Victory. Contemporary film historians think that 9 Men actually really sort of helped ease people in to Desert Victory, and it was nice to see
that makes sense.
More smaller representation of what men had been doing and fighting and how they'd been fighting.
It's much more personal than Desert Victory.
Yeah, exactly. So when Desert Victory comes out, that's where we get all the sort of footage that we know about. Like there's the footage of that lad, you know, capturing that Panzer driver. You know the sort of, if you know the Desert War, you'll know the sort of images that Desert Victory sums up.
Barrages, etc., etc.
Yeah, things like that. If you haven't seen it, it's a great one to find out. It was a nice little prelude to that. And I think 9 Men at the time, it was very, very well received and loved, but I think it's been lost to time, and it's well worth it. So, Matt, you had the cast this week.
I do. It's a really interesting little cast because we've got some Ealing stalwarts, then we have some really unexpected chaps pop up as well, which, you know, they come from a background which is completely different to some of the old sweats of Ealing Studios and the Ealing comedies, etc. So, leading the cast is Major Jack Lambert, who is playing Sergeant Watson, and he is the commander of this section. He'd previously been the Padre in the Captive Heart Squadron. He'd been in The Sea Shall Not Have Them, and he went on to do lots and lots of TV work later on. And he's one of 2 serving officers which appear in the film, the second being Captain Grant Sutherland, who plays Jock Scott. And Jock's sort of this hard Glasgow ex-policeman, and he hadn't had a very many roles before this. He'd been in like 1 or 2 pictures, and he was a captain instructor at a battle school during the war, and he took time out from that to be in this film because there's an article that Rob found in the documentary newsletter from February 43, and it talks about how they struggled to cast because the army wasn't willing to release people who hadn't been actors previously. Okay. So if they'd been an actor before the war, they were sort of happy enough to allow people to go off on short secondments to make films.
Sort of like how Niven does the Way Ahead because people know who Niven is, I guess.
Exactly. And there's no big name in this, really. You've got a few faces that are recognizable, like Lambert, and a very young Gordon Jackson, who
Very
plays
young.
a chap called the Youngun. He isn't given an actual name. He's 19. He's an apprentice in Edinburgh before he joins up. And Jackson himself had an uncredited role in One of Our Aircraft is Missing. And then his first big speaking role had been The Former Went to France, which is another Ealing film that Rob mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he's later MacDonald in The Great Escape. And he's Jock Carswell in Ip Crestfile. And he's in loads of TV as well, like The Professionals.
He had a CI5 in that one, yeah.
Yeah, you've got to mention him. And yeah, he's probably the most recognizable in terms of longevity. But if you're familiar with the Ealing comedies, then you'll recognize some of the other faces. You've got a character called Banger Hill, who ran a coffee stall in Civvy Street. Apparently, that's the backstory to the character, because there's a lot of little bits of exposition where he introduces the section and talks about their backgrounds and who they are. And he was played by Frederick Piper, who was a war reserve constable, which is really interesting because a lot of them are credited with their ranks at the time. So, as I said, Lambert was a major and Sutherland was a captain, but Piper is also credited as being a constable. And then we've got Bill Parker, who is played by Bill Blewett, and he's supposed to be the old sweat soldier, served in India. And he had an uncredited role in The Former Went to France as well. And he'd been in Watt's 1936 documentary about a small Cornish village. And he was a postman, and he'd sort of become a bit of a household name from that. And the film was named after him. It was called The Saving of Bill Blewett. Then we have Eric Mickelwood playing Gordon Lee, who's a younger actor, and he has a bit more of a clipped RP, posher background to the other men. And in that documentary newsletter, Watt admits to being a little bit reluctant to cast those sort of actors, and he looked at a lot of people for the role that Lambert was cast in, and some of them were either just terrible actors or they were just too RADA. They were too posh and clipped, in his words.
Because this is what Ealing Studios are doing at the time. They're making movies that have more sort of quote unquote real people in. So you see with like In Which We Serve, it's got members from all walks of life. By this point in the war, I think we're trying to show, or the film industry is trying to show more that we're all in this together for the long haul. So I think this is why you get less clippy sort of, hello, I'm Divinism. You get less sort of like that. You get more, bloody hell, mate, we're going to fight the Jerry's and the Italians.
Oh, there's some great slang and banter in this one. So what freely admits in the article he wrote that he'd gone a bit too far. And the producers suggested, well, it'd be a good idea to have someone from that background just to level things out and show that people from all walks of life are, in these battalions. And he was later actually had an uncredited role in Von Ryan's Express.
Oh, great.
But before he made this, he had been in Went the Day Well, which you mentioned earlier, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most interesting characters, though, is Jack Hosman's character,
Yes.
Joe Harvey. So Sergeant Jack Hosman had been a prisoner of war captured in France in 1940. He escaped not once but twice, managing to get back through to Britain, I think through Spain, I think. He was given the military medal when he returned. I think Rob's going to mention it in a moment, but he wrote a book about his escape. And apparently on set, he would take the crew aside and the cast, and he would train them on weapons drill. So all those great little shots of them cycling rifles and looking like they know what they're doing is partly due to Horsman's training that he was doing on the side as kind of like a military advisor almost.
But his book is called 1,000 Miles to Freedom, and it was about his experiences in the early war. And Kinematograph Weekly, again, they had a little article saying that the book was now available and saying how it added to the authenticity of Nine Men, because obviously the cast, it says about the casting and how Watt wanted authentic men in the movie. So yeah. It all ties up really nicely.
He'd never been in a film before. He wasn't an actor.
No.
But he does have that lovely little scene where he gets the there's a bit of a ricochet in the loophole that he's looking through, and it knocks his helmet. And he has this lovely little line where he says, "Well, I never thought these bloody things were any good," you know, and he delivers it really well. So he was definitely competent, and he stood his ground amongst a cast of probably more professional actors. A couple of other really interesting chaps in there. We had Fred Griffiths, who is briefly seen at the beginning of the film, and he's a sergeant in the sergeant's mess that Lambert's character goes and has a chat with, which is a really nice little scene, actually, because he's just sat there going, "How's your garden?" He's like, "Oh, I got it on my last 48 hours. I got it into shape, and we've got some decent tomatoes this year." Nine Men was actually his first on-screen role, and later on he was cast as Gracie in The Cruel Sea, and he also had a small role in 1958's Dunkirk. And later on, I think his last war film role was appearance in Dad's Army in 1971. And he was known for regularly playing a taxi driver in a lot of Ealing films. Then we have John Varley, who plays Dusty Johnson, who is he's the officer's Batman, basically, and he's badly wounded. He has a few nice little scenes with Lambert where Lambert's giving him some water, and he shouts encouragement during the first battle. Sadly, he dies not long after. And he'd previously been in Which We Serve. He'd later go on to be in Somewhere on Leave, and then he had an uncredited appearance in The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp as well.
Oh, nice. It's good pedigree there.
Yeah, so I think finally the one of the more interesting ones I came across was the uncredited appearance of Giulio Finzi, who was an Italian mechanic in the actual film. He sort of pops out of an armored car, which we are going to talk about in a moment, it's a great little scene. Anyway, he pops out of the top of this armored car, out of the turret, when the chaps go on a night patrol to try and scrounge some water out of the armored car. Finzi had been a solicitor in Italy before the war, but he was a Jew. So he managed to escape to the UK, and for a time he was held as an enemy alien, but he was released after, I assume, some vetting, and he somehow became involved in the film. One of the things I found about him, he joined the Pioneer Corps in about 1940-41, and perhaps that's how he came to hear about the film being made, and he was able to get the part in it, because he provides a little bit of Italian that's, I think, overdubbed in places, and there's a bit of conversation between the mechanics that are trying to get the armored vehicle to work again. But yeah, so he's a really interesting individual to pop up in this, and he was never in any films before or after this. But you've got to wonder, how did he become involved in the production?
Yeah, exactly. Interesting, really is. I love these little stories that we uncover when we look at the cast and things. It's just another really interesting thing about this movie that it throws up. It's like, wow.
Yeah, it's not a big name cast, but they're all very competent, and a lot of them have got really quite striking and interesting backstories that you would not expect.
Yeah, because it's not a film full of big names. Lambert was an actor, but he was a boxer as well, so he was famous, dually famous, I guess. I know he turned down work from Hollywood before the war to work in England, which is interesting. This is what Reg Whitley from The Mirror said about Jack Lambert. So it was he who was selected for the role, and he was persuaded by producer Michael Balkan to secure leave from the army. And the choice was a good one, he says, for everyone will be impressed by the fine acting of this typically British sergeant.
Carries it really well. And he's not too wooden. He's not too familiar with the men. He knows how to address soldiers. It looks at ease. He doesn't look like an actor playing an NCO. And he has a few scenes where there's some great NCO belittling and banter.
Yeah, he does get that really well. Yeah,
he does.
Those chaps he's drilling with and talking to in the barracks. We'll talk about the plot in a minute, why this all makes sense. Were actual serving members of the London Irish Guards. They were told to ad lib, so they're not actors there either. So that's another level of realism. So I feel that Lambert is genuinely being an officer's NCO talking to real men, and it looks very convincing. So to go into the plot a little bit before we go on to the alley tally. So the film's quite interesting in the sense that it's told through flashback. So the bulk of the movie is a flashback. So it starts off, we're at this battle school somewhere in England, it doesn't say, and you get a nice montage of men running through woods. crawling
Yeah,
under
like
barbed
like an
wire,
assault course.
an assault course, yeah, and you've got incremental parts of Watson, bossing them around, basically set to the Eighth Army March, and then they come in. They've done their train. They've done their their battle school training for the day, and they've all had enough. They're dirty. The men are annoyed. Like, they're throwing their kit around. One of them's like, oh, I'm cheesed off. I'm browned off. I am. They're giving it the whole sort of 40s anger.
There's that great bit where he turns the wireless on, and it's some very pompous radio program discussing
like Radio 4 documentary or
intricacies,
something. Yeah,
of an orchestral piece, and then he flicks onto another station, another and it's another program which is like opera singing, and
then you get the lads like saying about how they sort of had it and they're all tired.
They're fed up of training. They want to crack at the Jerrys.
That's it. Yeah, a bit like the Way Ahead, annoyed at training.
As soon as that started to develop, I thought, my God, this is so much like the New Lot and the Way Ahead.
It really is, yeah.
It just clicks with it so much. It's that dynamic of a group of soldiers and an NCO, isn't it? It's really interesting.
Yeah, and he gives them a sort of a little bit of a speech where he's like, oh, you lads need to be trained. You need to understand why this is important. And he goes, I'm only trying to give you un petit peu. And they all look at him a bit perplexed. I'm like, what the fuck he's talking about? And he goes, oh, it's French. It's un petit peu. It means a little bit something extra. And I'm trying to do that with you. You don't understand. Like, subtly saying to the audience, look, or anyone who's a soldier in the audience, like propaganda sort of thing, like, we need to do a bit extra to win this war. Sort of it. That line felt very much, he might as well have been talking directly to camera to me. He sits down, he goes, well, I'll tell you a story. If you want to know about fighting, I'll tell you a story of me when I was in one of them desert shows. And it sort of cuts, and then that's your main story of him chatting about what happened to him and his men. So, and I like the setup is nice. It fits quite nicely in.
Yeah, I really like the way that he continued to do it conversationally as what he was describing began to manifest as the flashback, and then it would cut from him doing the overdub of the I'm recounting a story to him giving someone an order, and it just worked really well. It's one of the best moves into a flashback.
Does really work.
Really
nicely.
Flowed quite.
It
quite
does
well.
flow nicely. Yeah, and then we get the start of the men, and they're all dealing in the desert. They get strafed by an ME-109. Their truck gets blown up, and then they find themselves in this burial hut.
It's a nice bit of model work, that 109, isn't it, though?
Yeah, it looks good. Yeah, it's
not
really
bad,
well done.
Not bad at all. Because, I mean, it's another one of those little surprises that pops up in this film, and you go, oh, wow, that's actually quite good for what is supposed to be like a low-budget, wartime, just quick off-the-cuff movie.
It never breaks the illusion of being in the desert either. I think that's the thing that I like the most about it. It's shot in such a tight way that you never feel like you're in Wales. On the evening of finding this hut, they finally found some shelter from the desert storm that kicks up. They finally find some shelter, but there's some Italian troops in the area, and they're trying to use the shelter as well. And Jack Watson says, I didn't want to shoot at them, but I knew if we didn't, we'd have had to fight them in the hut, and that's not good.
Yeah.
So they scarper, and he says, look, I knew we were in for it in the morning. And that's your setup. It's them holding the hut. So in the morning, they have probably go more into tally about their kit and things, but they have a little powwow, as Jack Watson says, a conference, and they talk about their ammo supplies and water supplies and everything else. And it turns out they've only got enough
very
ammo.
Nuts and bolts, and I really like
very nuts and bolts, yeah. And it turns out they've only got enough ammo for about maybe 2 days worth of fighting if they're lucky. Watson writes out his order for the day, which I really liked, because you sometimes lose the orders for the day in war movies and things. I like the added regimentalness about Watson. I really liked his character, and he writes down orders for the day, and it is to hold the hut until relief as number 1. Number 2 is if no relief comes, go on holding the hut. And
he pins it to the wall with a cartridge.
With a 303, round of 303, yeah. And then that's where the main action starts.
It's only an hour and 5 minutes long, thereabouts.
Very short, yeah.
But as Rob was saying at the beginning, it's a straightforward film. So you just get swept along with it, and you just enjoy the progression of this situation that the men are finding themselves in. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a last stand movie. And we love that subgenre of war movies on the pod, obviously, because because they're some of the most interesting. I mean, it's men in a dire situation, and a lot can be done with that in a narrative and also an action sense.
And you hear Watson narrates over certain parts, so he gives it the whole sort of like, I knew we were, if we didn't get out, if we weren't going to get out of here, I know we'd have to fight them hand to hand. It was going to be a bit of a run show, and I think it's very sort of representative of fighting men as well, and how you deal with men in that situation, and like what you do. It's not as much about, like Way Ahead is about how you become a soldier, and I think 9 Men is how you act as a soldier. Necessarily, it's sort of how they're two sort of similar things, but they're two very different things. This one's about training, how training sets you up to go into war with the way ahead, but then how this one actually is, well, this is how your training actually affects you in a fight.
Indeed. And I think one of the most interesting parts of that is the bit with the water that he's going to give to the wounded soldier. So they laboriously all pour out a tiny amount from their canteens into this into a mess tin, and he puts it on a ledge while he's going to pick up the soldier and get him comfortable to drink. And he explains that there must have been a glint off the mess tin because the Italians put a burst and shot the thing off the windowsill, and the water just gets poured into the sand. Basically, it flips the tin into the sand, and there's a beautiful, really, really beautiful shot of the upturned mess tin and the water seeping slowly into the sand,
bubbling into the sand.
There's some really gorgeous bits of cinematography in this film that work so well. There's the use of detailed close-ups, which we'll come back to when we talk about Ali Tali, etc. Really good. But that bit, he's still kicking himself months or possibly a year later that was a stupid thing to do, to put it on that ledge.
And
that's in there. That's in that overdub, the narrative, the narration over the top where he goes, and he's still kicking himself for that. And that links into that, the choices that you make from the training that you've had and how you learn. And that's something he's learned. He'll never do that again because he still remembers it so vividly. Yeah,
he's very hard nosed, but you sort of side with him because you're like, okay, well, he has to be, because this is a very dire situation. He's gonna have to use all his wits and stuff. And he's very down to earth with the men. Like he's not kidding them that they're gonna get out.
There's a couple of sequences where he sends out 2 guys with all the Mills bombs, the grenades,
and the tracer from the Bren.
And tells them to make as much noise as possible. So he's thinking ahead into how he can knock the enemy off balance,
trying to trick the Italians to think they've got more men.
So it shows him as a really well-rounded NCO, and he's more than experienced enough to try and deal with the situation. It's an interesting character piece, but at the same time, it's definitely trying to get across some lessons for people that are watching it.
I think so. Yeah. So I think that probably brings us to Ali Tali this week.
It's time for Ali Tali on Fighting on Film.
So as our resident weapons expert, Matt, do you want to kick us off?
Oh, I love this. It was so good. Like there's so many desert war films where they're either made as more character pieces and they're less action orientated, or they're made 20 years after the fact and they haven't got the equipment that's quite correct. But with the assistance of the War Office, we've got an 8-man section armed with what they should be armed with at this point. Their lorry have had to dismount and their truck's been destroyed. What kind of truck was it, by the way, Rob? Do we know?
I think, people can correct me if I'm wrong, because it's not a Bedford this week. I think it was an Austin K5.
I liked how they'd written Sue. They'd named the truck.
Nice. I like that. I think it was trying to imply again that they've been in the desert for a while. You've got time to name your truck. There's a nice little subtlety there. There's a lot of subtlety to this. There
movie. There's a lot of really great little bits of mise en scène, which we'll get to in a moment. But in terms of weaponry, they're all armed with Mark III SMLEs. The kind of star of the show is the boys' anti-tank rifle. Which,
wow!
when you think about it, I can't name many films in which it actually appears and does what it's designed to do.
In a movie sense, narrative movie, this may be the first time it's ever seen on screen.
I think it could well be, actually, yes.
You'll know more about it than me. You wrote the book on it, but is the pier in active service in February 43?
It's not widely known, that's for sure.
Right.
And it was tested. A number of them were taken to Tunisia.
Okay.
And there's some great footage on the Imperial War Museum's catalogue of chaps with them in Tunisia. Some of it filmed after the fighting had pretty much ended. Right. But its big debut was Sicily, obviously, and then Italy. But yeah, the boys' anti-tank rifle is the star. Well, one of the stars of the films, because it gets overshadowed right at the end. And
it's nice to see it being used as well. Like I thought it wouldn't get used.
Placed in the hut in the background initially, and you think, oh, are we going to see the anti-tank rifle used?
Yeah, it's nice.
Are we? Rubbing hands together.
Please let us use. Please, the minute you see it, it's like me and you. Obviously, people, we know fans of the show love the kit as well as much as we do. But when you see that boys anti-tank, you're like rubbing your knees. You're like, please let them shoot a tank with it or a truck or something, please. Because I think the thing to clear it up, the boys anti-tank rifle, it might get a little bit of short shrift now because people just look at this gun, this heavy calibered rifle and think, what the hell can that do? But in reality, the boys' anti-tank was a pretty decent bit of kit for what it was needed for. It's not meant to take on big tanks. It's meant to take on like the small reconnaissance trucks. Those little Italian tankettes. Good range. You'd make mincemeat of one. It's an unfairly represented rifle, and it's nice to see it actually having its day in this movie.
Well, we were so late to the concept. I mean, the boys only came in the late 30s.
Yeah.
So we were criminally late to the concept, and anti-tank rifles as a whole, as an actual weapon, quickly got overtaken as being an actual anti-tank weapon. As you say, as an anti-armored vehicle weapon, or as an anti-vehicle weapon, or an anti-materiel weapon.
Yes.
And they held their own throughout the war. And there's analogues of those today that are still in use. But yeah, as you say, in this film, this is spoilers, this is my fave scene, which we'll get to. But it gets used for exactly what it would have been used, and it's great. And it's literally just like Chekhov's boys anti-tank rifle, isn't
really,
it?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. We love that term. There's as we mentioned, there is an Italian armored fighting vehicle that gets seen on screen, and it's not it's a mock-up. It's a decent-ish mock-up. I don't know what the hell it's based off of, like the actual mock-up, but I think it's meant to be a Lancia LZ or a Lancia LZM Italian armored car from the First World War. Like they're sort of like a Rolls-Royce type esque armored car from the First World War. They've got that high turret with a machine gun in it. It's the best mock-up they could make, I think, of that. It doesn't look shocking, and it's not in the movie for so long that you can sort of pick it out and go, that's wrong, that's hokey. It does enough of a job. And they were used in the Desert War, in the Second World War, by the Italians as well. So it's not out of place.
It's clearly a mock-up, isn't it? And I thought I'd look at it as well, and I was racking my brain about what it is. And another option that it could also be is a Fiat Terni Tripoli, which was introduced in the 20s. And it could be one of those because they both look really similar.
They do, don't they?
It doesn't. Its bonnet isn't long enough to be a Fiat Terni Tripoli. The little turret looks like it, and the kind of back bit where it scallops down, and it does look a bit like the Lancia as well. So they've probably gone, well, we've seen bits like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's good enough.
Because the gun on it looks ridiculous.
But this is where the Italian bashing, shall we say, comes in. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't expecting it to be as heavy as it is, but Young and Gordon Jackson, he's like, oh, they've got a tank. They're coming. They've got a tank. They come over the ridge. And Watson's like, well, he's shocked. And he jumps up on there. Watson
thinks it's actually a tank.
Thinks it's a tank, yeah. And he goes, oh, no, it's one of those recce cars they've got. I've seen better things at fun fairs. It's a toy tank. Unfairly, I think the Italians get called out as this sort of second-rate force in the Second World War. Of course, they weren't as effective in the desert as the Wehrmacht or, the men under Rommel. But, they did fight relatively hard. They weren't a pushover as much as people think. There's a great book called Mussolini's War, actually, about the Italian army in the Second World War, and that is a cracking book. But they fight fairly okay. But think it's interesting that in this movie we get a lot of sort of, oh, don't worry, they're only Italians, or oh, they must have Germans fighting with them because they're putting up quite a bit of resistance. It's sort of,
Well,
it's
you get lots of those
yeah,
derogatory terms as well, don't you? Like macaroni munchers and spaghetti hound and
like ice cream slurpers and all that sort of thing. Yeah. But one thing I did like about the SMLEs before I have my pick, I really like seeing, I don't know about you, but I love seeing that the earlier SMLEs with the magazine cut-offs and the rounded firing. Was that a firing
yeah,
pin?
the cocking piece, yeah.
Cocking piece, the round ones. Yeah, I love seeing that. It's such a nice little touch. And especially when, because Watson's one has a magazine cut-off on it. And every time he loads his bolt, it's really subtle. I watched it a few times to check what he was doing. He really subtly moves the safety on and puts his rifle down.
He does.
It was so nice to see that. Like, his drills were immaculate. Obviously, serving soldier. Look, most of the guys, were in the forces. So it's really nice to see
drilling them as well, offset.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So all the drills in the movie are very accurate. The shooting stance, reloading from the shoulder is really nice to see. It's the Eighth Army on screen, isn't it? It's like it's what we think.
It is. Yeah. There's a little bit with one of the guys. I think it's the Old Sweat, and he loads in a charger.
Yes, that lovely close-up.
The charger, he strips the rounds into the breech, and then he just gently knocks it off with his thumb as he comes back to push the bolt home.
Really nice.
And that's another one of those really gorgeous detailed close-ups. And we get a lot of those with the weapons. We get a lovely one with the a couple actually with the boys, which I'll talk about in a minute with the favorite scene. But we get a lot of those as well, and we get some really nice close-ups of the officer's Webley that the sergeant's character takes over, and he describes it as an ornamental extra, which I loved.
Yeah,
when they're doing that great little sequence of taking stock of what weapons they've got. We got about 40 rounds a man, and then whatever Mills bombs we were carrying, and
12 Mills bombs or something.
Yeah,
6 or 7, I can't remember.
And there's a little cut to an ammunition box, which God knows where that came from because they weren't carrying one. And it's got all the ammo piled up on top of it. And then he asks Jock, how many rounds for the boys? And he's like, well, there's 10 in the mag and 1 in the spout. And that's just beautiful.
Lovely writing.
The detail that they go into of just making sure that we know the direness of the situation, of how tenuous they are with ammunition and water, etc. Those kind of little details are really nice. And that Webley, well, I think we'll talk a bit more about the Webley when we talk about the last battle in the film, because it comes into shine there, doesn't it? But my other pick is a weapon that I never expected to see ever. So this was
submachine gun gate for a few days, wasn't it, when we first saw it?
So when we were watching it for the first time, we spotted it. There's a little hand-to-hand sequence at the end, and one of the Italian soldiers has a submachine gun, which you look at and you go, that's not a Beretta. That's not a Thompson standing in for a Beretta. That's something different. And it's obviously something that's been taken as what I would call foreign representative. It's a foreign gun that people wouldn't see in films or newsreels. And they go, oh, that must be Italian, because they've never seen it before. They would just assume.
And he barely gets 2.5 seconds of screen time as well. You don't even see it fired, which is really
I know
weird.
You would think I do this for a job, wouldn't you? And, but it's noticeable. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can definitely spot it, because it's a weird looking gun. It kind of looks like an M1928 Thompson, but it's squatter, and it looks a bit Sten-like at the back.
Like if a Mat 49 and a Thompson had a baby, it'd look like that.
Yeah. But what it actually is, it's a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. It's a Spanish Labora, which is a very high-end, actually, submachine gun that was made in Catalonia by the Republicans. And God knows how that reached Britain. I was speaking to a colleague about this, and he was saying Mark Dyneley may have smuggled some in before the war. But we don't really know. Dyneley obviously was later associated with Baptiste, and we've spoken about him when we talked about It Happened Here. And he was a very prolific collector of arms and small arms, and there's a possibility that's how it ended up in this country. So when we were watching the film, I was like, I don't know what that is. I couldn't place it, and I looked at it a few times, and I said to Rob, "Have you seen this? Did you spot this?" And he was like, "Yeah." So
I thought it was a Mark V Sten, didn't I? Yeah.
Yeah, because it does have that weird little wooden foregrip, which is actually the magazine housing.
Yeah.
That's where the magazine goes in. So the gun in the film doesn't have a magazine because it fed from a 36 round magazine, and they're quite long. You would notice it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I reckon I was like, that looks a bit like this. So I went and grabbed my trusty Jane's recognition guide, given to me by my granddad when I was 6. You can see
every boy should have one.
Exactly. So I'm there flicking through, and I'm yeah, it's the Spanish Labora. And I bet you that gun in that book is the exact same gun that's in the film, because there's no magazine with that one either.
Yeah, oh, interesting.
I'm wondering whether whoever took the photos for that book, because there can't be that many of them about.
I mean, wow, there's one for the Spanish Civil War submachine gun fans among us.
Yeah, what a cool little link, though.
Really
weird.
Exactly. And it's a nice link because, as much of a link it is, I guess, but one of the characters fought in the Spanish Civil War. So there's a connection, I guess, there. Yeah.
A little bit.
So for me this week, I really liked the uniforms, and I like seeing the different sorts of uniforms that are on show. So early on, when the men are doing their battle drill at the battle school, they're wearing denims, battle dress denims, which is nice because that was used for rough working, working out in the field, things like that. So it's nice to see. And interesting, those men actually have P14s in some of those scenes.
They do. Some of them have got number 1 Mark IIIs, and then some of them do have P14s, which is an interesting mix, actually, when you consider that they were a frontline battalion that was pulled in for the film. And there's one chap with a M1928 Thompson as well.
There is, very briefly. And then when we get to the desert, the men have khaki drill uniforms. They've got their shorts. Some of them have got 08 webbing. Some of them have got 37 pattern. But I didn't look. I couldn't remember if 08 was used in the desert. I mean, perhaps second line.
I didn't even
troops.
notice. Yeah.
Yeah. You're the old chap. Because you can tell because his belt's quite thick. But at night time, they go on this raid to try and get some water from the knocked out. Sorry, I don't want to ruin Matt's scene, but there's the armored car gets knocked out.
The boys does the trick, lads.
I wonder
it's
what
fine.
did that. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. But they've changed into thicker clothing. And first watch, I was like, oh, okay, they've got their
comforters go on and stuff.
Cap comforters, battle dress jackets. Watson puts on a lovely pullover, looks really nice. And I initially was like, oh, okay, they're changing for their raid. Like they want to be a bit more darker for the nighttime sort of thing, trying to be a bit more stealthy.
He's there rubbing himself down with sand.
Yeah, doing all that sort of thing. Yeah. But then on the second watch, I was like, hang on a minute. They're changing into warmer clothes because the desert gets cold at night. Yeah. And I thought it was a really nice little inclusion. And then in the morning, they've still got all that uniform on. They don't change out of it because it's like, I just really like the inclusion. I thought it was a really nice little touch there. Yet again,
it's great mise en scène, isn't it?
Yeah, just a nice little detail that sort of makes the film stand out. You know, it's like we like the detail in Sea of Sand, and this sort of is carried back, I guess.
Did you spot Jock tying his bayonet on?
I did. That was nice. Yeah.
Yeah, to dampen the rattling a bit.
Really nice.
He's running a little bit of twine between the rifle and then round it, and then he ties it off just to stop any rattle.
And then I have to mention them because I was jumping in my seat when I saw them. So this won't ruin the ending, but there is an appearance of Crusader tanks. Yeah. And it's just wonderful to see Crusaders, because I sort of just like, oh, they've got a Crusader. Oh my God. I was like, wow, like when it's great.
I know.
I'll talk about it in detail in my favorite scene.
Got to be the only time a Crusader Mark I has appeared in an actual film.
So nice. Yeah. It looks really
that isn't
great.
Stock footage. Two of them.
Yeah. Two of them. I couldn't see where they would have got them from, but at that time of the war, they might have been range weapons, or they would have been training on them. You know, they weren't frontline tanks anymore. I don't think they might still have been used in the desert.
Yeah, I don't know. Mark I's perhaps not, but
perhaps not in use as prevalently. But they're really nice to see, and yet again, it dates the movie really nicely for early desert war, which is.
And I was like, is that a Covenanter? and that would have been insane if it had been a Covenant, because obviously they were more used as training tanks.
Me and Matt were chatting, and I was like, "No, it cannot be a Covenant, Matt, because it hasn't got the exposed radiator at the front. I think you'll find it's a Crusader tank."
Yeah, and then I double checked the number of wheels and such, and noticed that it has the Beezer turret at the front, and I was like, "That's got Beezer."
I watch Tank Chat, so I know what I'm talking about, Matt. Come on. And a shout out to the Italians. They look okay. I know some of the kit isn't 100%, but
so I managed to track down some of that. I managed to find that the helmets they're wearing are actually Spanish M1926 pattern.
Very nice. I thought
rather than the Italian.
They look similar, don't they? Very similar.
Well, again, it's representative foreign.
Yes.
They look
they
look different to the British. They look different to German, which is nice that they gave them an Italian enemy. Could have easily just gotten a load of World War One German kit that they had, and because they did that quite often.
Yeah, lads running around in Stahlhelms like they do in Sahara 43. That's very stereotypical German.
A lot of those Italian troops are armed with weird things like charger loading Lee Enfields, the long one that predates the SMLE. Some of them do have SMLEs, but some of them in the close-ups in that same sequence where the Labora is seen.
Yeah,
they do have a Kakano 1891.
I thought I spotted
which is nice. Yeah, nice, so there is some actual captured Italian stuff in there.
It's just nice to see the Italians represented, because I know there are films about the Italians at war, but they're Italian productions. And obviously you've got Captain Craig Mandolin.
They're often just discounted.
They are just discounted, but in this film they get a fair crack of the whip, I think. They are seen as, they are pressing home their attacks. They're not just giving up, but they do give up, but we'll talk about what they do later on. So I think that concludes the Alley Tally for this week, and let's get stuck into fave scenes, because there are some really good scenes in this movie.
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show. So Rob, favourite scene?
So my favourite scene, I'm going to spoil the ending for everyone. Really sorry if you haven't seen it.
Well, we always do,
Yeah, really sorry. But my favourite scene's got to be the ending where they finally go in with the bayonet. So the movie...
It's classic Last Stand.
It's really good. So they know they're going to get overrun. They're running out of ammo. They've got the Italians have put a mortar up. They're shelling the position. There's some great shots of chunks of sort of like rock and things being blown off of the hut.
Masonry getting blown off the corners of it and stuff.
I can't remember the character. I can't remember who it is.
Jock's on the boys with the last 2 rounds.
Yeah, Scotty's on the boys.
And then I think is it Bill, the old sweat, who pulls the round out the wall?
I think it might be him. So the round that's stuck in the order for the day, he turns around and looks for more ammo, and he sees it, he pulls it out. The order sort of falls to the floor, gets covered in sand.
Very cinematic.
Puts it in, and you get Sergeant Watson looks at him and says, "Look, remember, in the end, we'll go out and meet them with bayonet." And Scotty says, "Oh, I've got 2 rounds left for the boys," sort of, and he's giving it away, giving it some. And Watson goes, "Both make them both count, and then we go in with bayonet." So it's getting close. And then they go, "Right, okay." So they look around and they've all run out of ammo. So they all sort of get hyped up. They fix bayonets. Watson's hyping them up. He says, "Are you ready? Are you ready, boys?" And they'll go, "Yeah." He goes, "Come on then." And you get this really nice shot. And it is really well done. I really love this part of the movie. They all come out. They're all pumped up, ready for it. Watson comes out first. He's got his Webley. He's got a machete from somewhere, and he's charging. They're all hooting and hollering. You've got a nice close-up of every man running and screaming, and they all look, they've got the bit between their teeth. They're not stopping. Yeah. And then they all meet a man, and they get gripped in hand-to-hand combat. But then you've got the rest of the men who are in a trench outside, and they see them come out, and the old soldier, he goes, "Look at them, come on lads, it's time." So they get up and they go to meet the enemy, and you get a lovely, one of the guys uses his last round to shoot from the hip and taking it out with an Italian.
I think it's the fairly young posh chap.
Posh chap, yeah, he does
shouting Yahoo as he does it.
And then we get some really nice choreographed fight scenes with Italian troops, and it's very visceral. I know that Watts said in an interview later on in his career, the only part of the movie that made him feel uneasy was the hand-to-hand combat scene, because he thought he'd overdone it.
It's brutal, actually, for the
they
period.
Are brutal,
It's on a par with Bataan, I thought.
Yes, it is. You get men that they're choking each other, they're hitting each other with anything they can grab.
There's a lot of bayonet work going on.
Bayonets in people. I think the young'un gets his Fairburn Sykes out, and he's actually you see him stab people with it. And I wasn't expecting it. We actually get it's a swear word. It's not the worst swear word in the world, but they go, "Come on, you bastards! Come on, you bastards!"
Yeah. I was quite surprised to hear that. Yeah,
I was too. Unlike Bataan, where they machine gun out the curse words, in this one they do go for it. And then it all is lost. I'm thinking, because at this point in the movie, I'm caught up in the story, so I'm like, oh god, they're all gonna die. Like, oh my god, and I'm thinking, Rob, it's a flashback. Come on, you know that Watson doesn't die, but it really draws you in. It cuts away, and you see some Austin Fives come, like into
some lorried infantry coming in,
and the 8th Army March starts, and it's like and it sort of starts up. And then the Crusader tanks come in, and I was just like, I was gone. I was just like, yes, come on, boys. I really pumped me up first time I saw this film.
I honestly, I did actually get goosebumps when the Crusaders appeared.
I think I did as well.
And it sounds weird, doesn't it, to say that about an 80-year-old film? But I really honestly did. I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. And that's what you get with this film, because it's obviously it's not the biggest budget production. So when those tanks do appear over the ridge and they're there to save the day, and then it still has the effect it would have had in the cinema.
It really does. And then the Crusaders come over the ridge line, and one of the chaps says, "Look, sir, look." And you see the Crusaders coming over the hill, and you get this really nice shot of it's a low shot of Watson looking, and he goes, "Oh, the beauties, the bless them so much. God bless that wee man upstairs, the beauties." He's really elated. He's so relieved, and you get some beautifully shot scenes of inside the Crusader, of them calling out, "Give him a bit HE. They won't like that," and they fire a shot into the ridge line,
there's the tank commander, and he goes through all of the orders. Enemy on the ridge line, HE, load, on target, fire. And you get these great close-ups, like the breech being loaded, the gun's trigger being pulled. He's looking through a vision slit.
Proper Crusader porn for like 10 seconds. Yeah. It's wonderful.
And the bit where he pops out the turret and the Crusader, the turret lid just like pops open and slides back.
It's so nice.
So good.
It's so nice. And then and the battle's won. You get this nice sequence where they're all mopping up, and the chap who got captured early on, he comes back, and they're all elated that the battle's over. And and then he sees the lads sort of resting, and he immediately goes back into sort of hard-nosed NCO, and he's like, "Right, come on, we're back at the truck in 5 minutes. Come on." And you get the old soldier. He's like, "Some say good old Sarge," and the other one goes, "But others say bleeding ankle biter." And then they're back. They're just back to being like NCO and troops. And it's
straight back into the dynamic.
Straight back into the dynamic, and it's a beautiful end to a really good film.
Yeah, because the sergeant goes into the hut, and he picks up the order for the day off the floor, and it's in a little sprinkle of sand. Clears off the sand, and he looks down at it, and there's a lovely little close-up detail shot of it, and you go, "Oh, look at that! It's paying up. Look at that!"
Yeah, it's so nice.
It's so good. And you didn't even mention the Webley, because that hand-to-hand fight.
Yeah.
Oh my god! So he's got the poor Lieutenant Webley, who gets killed by the air attack, and he charges out with it in one hand, and as you said, Rob, machete in the other. And he starts point shooting, and there's lots of these little bits where they save one another. And he drops like an Italian that's about to bayonet. I think we don't really see who it is because it's all moving so quickly. It's very well shot, and it flows beautifully. But he's firing from the hip, and you get lots of really nice close-ups of just his hand and the pistol as it's firing. Yeah, and it's very effective. That whole scene is so well done.
It's beautiful, isn't it? It's just a really great end to the film. Like I wasn't expecting to be so emotionally invested in that ending, but I really was. Especially seeing it for the first time, I really got into it. So Matt, what's your favourite scene? Well, I think
Well,
I
as
know
we
you
alluded
alluded
to,
to it the
yeah,
whole
as we
episode.
alluded to, and
Yeah.
we've spoiled half of it, but it's the scene with the boys, and as I said, it's Chekhov's boys anti-tank rifle, and it's sat on this crate in the corner as they're all getting ready for the battle.
Yeah.
And Gordon Jackson says there's a tank coming, and they quickly identify it's not in fact a tank; it's a light recce vehicle,
A toy tank, as he says.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Perfect fare for the boys. So the sergeant takes Jock outside with it, he's the boys anti-tank rifleman of the section by the look of things. And he drops down in the doorway, and there's a lovely little close-up of him twisting the monopod, which raises and lowers the elevation of the gun.
It's nice.
So he's laying the rifle on target, and the sergeant says, "Put 2 in the driving compartment," and he runs the bolt. We get a lovely close-up of the muzzle. We get a lovely close-up of the action. We get some nice establishing shots of the car coming on and the Italians running around at the sides. And he puts 2 rounds into the driving compartment as ordered and knocks out the armored vehicle. And it's just a brilliant little scene that shows the boys doing what it was designed to do: stop armored vehicles. And it has the most satisfying sort of sound effect where it sounds like a tin pot's being hit when the round hits the vehicle. It's so good. But that has to be one of my absolute favorite parts of the film.
It's really nice. The sound of that AFV getting hit is just beautiful, isn't it? I loved it.
It's great. And all the other guys are running blank through their SMLEs. So they're cycling things, and it all looks
the sound works
rather
really
good.
Nice. Like nothing. It's not like war movies now where everything is so overproduced and and so well done. It just feels right. It feels natural. This one. There's a charm to this film.
It's very effective,
and there's not a lot of soundtrack through it, so it is quite atmospheric.
As a sum of its parts, the film works so well because it's a small, tight cast character piece, last stand based.
Yeah,
it's very sort of Lost Patrol, and as I mentioned earlier, Sahara, which is based on Lost Patrol. It works in that same dynamic.
Again, we've bled over the final thoughts,
as we always seem to. As some of its parts, I think the film does a fantastic job of making this really tight little piece of cinema.
It really does. I did some more research on how the movie was received at home. Obviously, because Desert Victory comes out right after, and it's one of the big wins for the British Army is the Desert War early on. Obviously, getting our rear ends kicked early war, and it all seemed a bit lost, and the army hadn't had a victory yet. The Ministry of Information, when they did I forget what they were called. We talked about them before on the podcast. When they take how people thought of things week to week. I forget what they were called.
I know what you mean. The surveys they did.
Surveys. Yeah. The surveys of regular people. So it's from this a book called British War Films 1939-45, Cinema and the Services by S.P. Mackenzie. And he's writing about how Desert Victory was received and how 9 Men was received. So he writes, Desert Victory, like 9 Men, represented a composite picture of the British Army, offering different aspects to different constituencies. It was a well-crafted film. The victory it celebrated strongly buttressed by the ongoing success of the 8th Army. The powers that be would have been happy to read the response of a young London architect after seeing the film. It made you feel that at last the army was a worthwhile thing. I really like that. And I think this movie does the 8th Army justice. I think, obviously, they don't need any justice doing. We all know the heroism and the great victories that we had in the desert, but sometimes it's important to think from a 1942, 1943 standpoint, when the war was, we're not going to lose it, but it could go either way in certain theatres,
I know what you mean, yeah.
I think for its own movie in its own right, if you enjoy The Way Ahead, if you like those sort of movies about infantry, this movie is such a great hidden gem. If you're an Ealing film fan, please seek it out because it's Ealing in a different light. It's different filmmaking from Ealing. Henry Watt's work is great as well. If you like London Can Take It, if you like Squadron 992, this movie is worth seeking out because he can do fiction. I recommend it. I mean, we don't score movies, but if we could score it, I'd give it an 11 out of 10 because I think it's fabulous. And if anyone from Talking Pictures TV is listening, or whoever owns the rights to this movie, get it on telly because it is it's worthy of it.
I imagine if you asked a lot of people, they would never have heard of this.
No, I mean, we ran a guess the movie type thing on the Twitter before we started recording, and it took a while for some people to get it. So it was quite interesting.
Yeah, it definitely is, as you say, one of those hidden gems.
Yeah,
It's just so well produced. It's a really well crafted, well rounded film.
it is.
That it's got a solid cast. There's beautiful mise en scène, great cinematography. It has that undertone message, as you were saying, but it's also a straightforward last stand piece, and that always works really well as a dynamic.
It's really well done.
For me, all of those little detailed close-up shots of the men getting their kit ready, working weapons, and then the inclusion of some of those surprising elements like the Crusaders, it really levels that film up. Yeah. And I think it is definitely one of my absolute favorite North African theatre films. I think it's got to be one of the best.
That's another one for your watching pleasure. I know it's
do
a bit
seek
hard.
It out, definitely.
Do seek it out. It's a bit hard to find, but we will be giving away a DVD copy on the Twitter, so look out for that at Fighting Your Film if you don't follow us already. And as some of you Patreons would have seen, that we've booked some really good guests coming up. I won't spoil the beans just yet, but keep up to date with the Twitter, and you'll find out soon enough. We're booked until March now, I think, aren't we? So that's quite interesting.
I think we are, and I'm working on some others. And incidentally, if you do join us over on Patreon as a supporting cast member, what we'll be doing is with some of those guests, we'll give you the opportunity to ask some questions.
Yes.
About the topics we'll be discussing in the film. Definitely keep an eye out for that as well.
Yeah, I just had that okayed actually by one of our guests, which was nice.
Excellent.
So as always, thank you for listening. The next film we're covering is the Munich film, the new one that's going to be on Netflix. So look out for that. We've got a guest for that one too. And that'll be next week. So looking forward to... That one's
going to be very interesting.
I think it will be, yeah. Jeremy Irons as Chamberlain. I like the sound of that.
That's a good casting. It's a strong casting.
Yeah. Will it appease audiences like Chamberlain trying to appease the Nazis? We'll find out next week, everybody.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
See you next week.
Bye.